I first wanted to start with, I saw a reel of you talking about the Book of the Five Rings, and I think you referred to it as not a philosophy book, but like your favorite philosophy book. And so I kind of wanted to ask, yeah, why?
Good question, I guess. Yeah, that was a long time ago. I find that almost in like a Wittgensteinian way, like definitions don't come, they're not essential. They come from like act and play. So in a way, like the greatest comedy movies aren't even comedy movies, and the greatest, philosophy books aren't philosophy books. But specifically with that book, I mean, I found it in a really interesting way. It was like I kept having this recurring dream of this like eyeball, and it would like turn back inside of its eyelids, and this like recurring theme and this recurring like statement of I think it was like perceive that which can never be perceived or something. Either I was saying it in the dream or someone was saying it to me, or it was just like happening as that eyeball imagery was. So I spent the day just like looking through movies like Lord of the Rings and Matrix, trying to find that scene. And then I eventually just looked up that phrase, and apparently that's one of the principles from the first chapter of that book, which is interesting. I don't believe in like the supernatural or anything. I think it was just a coincidence, but that's how I found it. And it kind of, that statement, perceive that which cannot be perceived, is very, we could say, thematic of the whole text. Like, it's a kenjutsu handbook, so like martial arts, but in a lot of ways, it's very like metaphorically teaching you about how to succeed in life. Like, it's teaching you that life isn't about magic or waiting for your moment. It's about getting it yourself, being practical and interacting with the world.
And how did you interpret that perceive, not to be perceived?
I guess, well, the reason I got into philosophy was to find answers for things that science couldn't. Like, I grew up an atheist. I'm still an atheist, but very scientific person. But there was just, even that dream itself, like, didn't have a scientific answer, right? 'Cause science tells you we're just an empty shell, an empty body. But that kind of stuff just isn't answered by science. Neither is free will, neither is ethics, this kind of stuff. So in a way, that's how I perceive it, or I interpret that as like perceive that which science doesn't answer, or empiricism can't answer.
Yeah, I've been reading Descartes at the moment, and one of his fundamental things for his philosophy is that there's the only thing true is the self, or that's the only thing that we can know for sure exists. Everything outside in the material world can't necessarily exist, and that's because our senses deceive us is just basically answer for that. And so one conclusion you can go to is that metaphysics is actually more real than physics in some ways, because I kind of went along the thought pattern of if our senses deceive us, then what does it mean for something to exist? And I think he sort of goes along the lines of, well, something exists if it kind of changes us, if it how it relates to us and how it changes the way we think and how we doubt. And so I think maybe on similar lines, things like these, I guess the perceived not to be perceived, what's not to be perceived could come under the lines of love and all these emotions and these all these intangibles. And I think that's more of an existing world that we live in than maybe the material world. I mean, I'd like to know your thoughts and Joel's thoughts on that. But yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to know Joel's thoughts first, if you have anything.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. I like this idea that there's some books that aren't like obviously overtly about philosophy can be philosophical texts, because it just makes sense in my head. I think a lot of philosophical insight comes from pursuing things in normal life outside of just like reading about what Aristotle said or Plato said or what Descartes said. It's like specifically pursuits of mastery in something, like, this book's about a martial art. I think that's a great example. But also, like, for my life, like sport, so much stuff about being an athlete actually becomes quite philosophical when I think about it, or what it means to be a good athlete or a good friend or a good partner. Like, these things we do in our life that seem non-intellectual or non-philosophical can actually provide us and be like that source of so much insight. And kind of vice versa, I guess. When we read philosophy, it then helps us be better friends and better students and better athletes and whatever the thing we're trying to pursue is. So that's a nice point. And then on that, yeah, it's true, Jacob. I feel like what that quote is pointing to is a fantastic part about being human. Maybe a real great way to go about your life is to try and understand and grasp stuff that seems initially so unknown, so ungraspable, so mystical. In that mystical nature, there's actually something quite awe-inspiring, profound about it. Like you say, like love and like beauty and things that evoke a kind of transcendental set of emotions, like a sunset, as we've talked on previous episodes before. The pursuit of trying to understand what those things are and why they make us feel the way we feel that's like at the core, I think, of like a philosophical pursuit, because those are the feelings that make us feel truly alive. That's bliss, that's ecstasy, and if we can figure out what that is and try and grasp it and try and sort of articulate it, then we can find more of it and kind of spread that word. So I like it a lot.
Yeah, I mean, if I have to add to that, I mean, I'm conflicted because that first chapter is where those 9 principles are, and I think that's like the 7th. But the first principle is don't think dishonestly, and it almost to me feels like, how are you supposed to not think dishonestly and perceive what you can't perceive? Like, don't you have to have empirical evidence to not think dishonestly? But then again, you have to also just accept logically that you can't perceive everything. So I don't believe in a separate realm or anything like that, but I definitely believe humans, we can't understand it all. Descartes, I have a lot of problems with Descartes and just how he thinks and his solipsism, because I think you can prove the existence of others. You can prove these things through how we relate to each other. Jacob, you mentioned like how you relate to others and through the world is kind of how you have evidence for this stuff. But I think Descartes was more of a solipsist in that way, or at least that's my readings. Yes, my answer is kind of like, or what I have to add is very conflicted. Like, yeah, perceive that which can't be perceived, but also understand that if you can't perceive it, you don't know for sure what it is.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I see why you would think why you would disagree with Descartes. I mean, there's problems with the thought of just how he just goes for certainty, like how he just accepts certainty, the self exists and nothing else. Yes, that may be the only thing that we can know exists, but is that a really good way to live? And so there's critiques like Hume, who would argue maybe like there's other ways to find certainty. I think he says about how his line of thought is how it comes from repeated experience, I think. And then there's maybe like, I think Heidegger and Nietzsche also kind of critiques them, and maybe I think there's more context to it. And I wanted to go into the Book of the Five Rings. I believe this. Could you talk about how like he talks about these forces of like water, earth, and fire, things like this. Yeah, I'm kind of interested if you know anything about that.
Yeah, I think the 5 sections in order are the earth, water, fire, wind, and void scrolls, and they kind of match the vibe of the name. Like, the earth scroll is grounded, but it's also metaphorical, so it's teaching you more about like training and like more of the overview of martial arts in general, and talking about like other strategies. The water scroll, I guess, would be next. The water scroll is all about like fluidity, literally how to adapt during battle, but also during training, how to kind of like flow with your own current or something. What would be the next? Earth, water, fire. So the fire is about like intensity and timing. So just think of fire, and that's kind of what that's about. I mean, specifically timing, he talks a lot about in that chapter, I think, if I remember correctly, how to, dodge and how to block certain attacks. Earth, water, fire, wind. The wind scroll is the most confusing to me. But I think wind means something like, in Japanese, it means something like practice or like something of that nature, like practice or discipline. But I think it's about more like, he talks a lot about the old strategies it means strategy, I guess, or act. But yeah, he talks a lot about comparing his strategy to older martial arts strategies and how his are better, basically. And then I think the last is the Void Scroll. The Void Scroll is the most interesting philosophically, I would say. It just goes into like consciousness and the nature of the mind and how to calm your mind so you can be a better warrior or whatever, sword fighter.
And so are these kind of like symbols that are like sort of hyper true of like human existence. Like we've all got this kind of fire of timing and kind of when we're ready to attack, but then we're also kind of formless like water. Is it kind of sort of modes of being, would you say?
Yeah, I would say so. I don't think they're objective or anything, but they definitely are referring to something objective. Definitely, yeah. Because you can just kind of intuit the connection between the names and what they're talking about. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that, isn't it? That you can, forces of nature can then relate to ways of being and behavior in certain situations. It's kind of on that same point of like how theory and philosophy then can be grounded in what we do in our mundane lives. How you can take kind of, it's weird, isn't it? It's like you take the essence of a fire or the earth or the nature of water. That's something in that essence can also then be applied into how you are as a martial artist or into whatever you're doing in your life. And it sounds so spiritual and woo-woo and abstract, but it's real. Something in us really kind of clicks and and understands that fire means intensity. And then that's why we use metaphors all the time in just our like daily language. We say someone's burning with rage, or there was steam coming out their ears. It's like we associate kind of the force of nature with an emotion, with a way of acting then. And then, you know, this book's talking about how we can integrate that consciously, like try and be possessed by some sort of, you know, spirit of fire and intensity and rage in situations if we need that, or be fluid like water or whatever. It's like there's this weird fusion of the abstract and the real, which is, I think, is quite interesting.
It's where the phoenix comes from.
Yeah, exactly. That, you know, burning and then being reborn. It's like that's a motif that we experience in our lives. In the story of our lives, we have moments where things knock us down, or like an old self that we once were has to die for then a new self to be born from the ashes of that rebirth. And that's a huge thing in nature, where it's the life cycle of the seasons, when the leaves fall off the trees and then grow back again in spring. It's like there's all these motifs that go on through nature, but they're also going on through us as well, and in a microcosm of our own lives. And it's again it's kind of another strand of connectedness between us and the universe in a way.
Does it talk about in that book like the integration of these forces, of like how to be like a good samurai?
Yeah, I'd say mostly in the first and last chapter, but yeah, the chapters are kind of distinct from one another though. They're very organized. The book itself is like really obsessive, really meticulous. If I had to guess, Musashi was probably autistic or something, but it was written in 1645, so who knows?
And remind me, what was that void chapter you said at the end? What was that about?
Mostly human consciousness, like the mind, I guess, like how to calm your mind, I would say.
And how do we calm our mind?
Meditatively, I guess. Kind of, it's like a light switch. You kind of have to just turn it on and focus and like lock in, I guess, yeah.
It is like is that void, the, you know, what's really there when the ego and the sort of worldly self is kind of put to rest in a state of meditation, when you can be in a state of awareness that's kind of like underneath all that stuff. Is that what the void is? That kind of, because void has quite a negative tone, doesn't it? It sounds sort of like a black hole, or like an endless nothingness, when maybe a void can be a positive thing. It's a place where you don't have to pretend to be this like human being that, or this human persona that we act out in the world. That's like that's the oneness, the one consciousness that we're all kind of one tiny fragment of, and we're kind of wrongly led to believe that we're all separate individuals, and really we do come from this one same void. And then if you can act from that place, sometimes when it's necessary, you act without ego, and there's a level of deep presence to that. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good interpretation. In a lot of Japanese mythos, nothingness or something is the non-terminal domain that creates stuff, creates being or something into the world. So yeah.
Well, I think on a general point, what we think we want is, like, we think we want more, but actually a lot of the things we're searching for is a closeness to nothingness. Like, nothingness sounds bad, but what do I mean by that? I just thought then, what's like the most meaningful experience on an everyday level for a human being is to be in a flow state. And when you're in a flow state, a part of that is you lose your sense of self. It's like you're not really there. You're so engaged in something that you're no longer like viewing things through who you are with your name and your own set of skills and things. You almost become that activity. You become part of the void. You are just the painting that's being created, or you're just the book that's being written, or you're just the piece of music that you're listening to, whatever it is. And it's like, we're looking always, or I think always we're looking to escape our own minds in a way. And that's the stuff that brings us this peace and this joy, actually, is coming closer to the void, not being in the noise of a human mind, and going to the place where there isn't that noise, which could be seen as the void, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
I think, yeah, if you picture yourself as the samurai, a samurai is like a peaceful guy. Like, he's a Mr. Miyagi. He lives kind of stoically, but also has a lot of tranquility and meditates. And even when he's fighting, like, there are times to use the fire and the water, but he kind of still knows that he's a finite being in an infinite universe. And I think it's a good way to live. I think there's some wisdom in that. I wanted to pivot slightly and ask about this. I saw a reel of you where you were talking about how there's no subconscious, and I basically want to ask about, like, expand that topic.
Yeah, I guess what I meant by that was more challenging, like Freud or Carl Jung's conception of the unconscious or subconscious, because obviously there's subconscious / preconscious faculties. Like right now, I'm not really thinking about my words that much. They're just happening. So obviously there's some semblance of unconsciousness, but I think this modern conception, psychological conception, is very wrong in how it treats that. So it treats it almost as like this magical mental space, and where you can like draw insights from it, or sometimes they use that to like diagnose you with certain mental illnesses. They try to like psychoanalyze you. And I just find a real problem with that, because you have one brain. You really consciousness has a surface, and then it has what's underneath the surface. But to me, it's one pool, it's one ocean, basically.
Yeah,
I guess the
it's
point
fun.
where sorry, I was just gonna say the point where it gets reflected is what you see, right? Because it's the surface, it's reflecting the world. But that doesn't mean what's underneath isn't still like within your control, basically.
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, I agree with you. I think the issue arises when there's so much like imagery and narrative around the unconscious, whether that goes from like the classic ones I was taught in school about seeing the mind like an iceberg, and that there's, you know, this very small tip that's the conscious mind above the surface of the water, but so much of what's really going on is underneath the water, or it's, you know, Jung's sort of imagery about these collective unconscious, where we imagine we've all got this kind of like underground psyche that knows things that we don't currently know, and there's always kind of playful, a very abstract imagery going on. And I think the problem arises when we take that imagery literally. Like, what these great thinkers have had to do is use these kind of metaphors to make us try and understand something that we can't truly grasp because it is unconscious. But obviously there's truth to it, in that there are so much things, even just as simple as biological processes, that are going on completely out of our control. And then you could maybe elaborate that to, yes, there will be psychological processes going on that aren't under our control, like, you know, the ways that we feel in social situations when we're hit with anxiety or something. It's not like a choice that we make, but that's to do with how we're being perceived in that social hierarchy, and depending on our competence and how we know people and all that kind of stuff. So there is things going on, but I think when we go into those, you know, Freudian, Jungian imagery, which I do love and I find really fascinating, if we take that as being objective, that there's like this dark little dungeon in our own brain, then I think we're moving away from how things actually are. But that we have to see those as that's a metaphor to help us understand. It's not necessarily like the way it is.
So
Yeah.
what would you kind of like attribute maybe the thoughts that we're not aware we're doing, or sorry, yeah, the actions that we're not aware we're doing? What would you kind of attribute that to?
Me? I guess time, like how time works. So there's like one immanence for everything, but like our brain is an object, and so is brain chemistry. So you can't really think about multiple things at once. So things like anxiety, I think, are past thoughts or even future thoughts kind of like arising when they're not supposed to, or arising when you didn't, want them to, because or interrupting, let's say, your present mode of being. So that's basically what I'd attribute it to, is kind of your past self interrupting your current self.
I mean, I can see the point there, because conscious you only has a certain bandwidth of like information that you can deal with and that you can process at one time. Whereas past you has been through a lot and learned a lot. And then, what the mind does is we rely a lot then on things that we've learned from the past, sort of ideas around what is expected of us in situations, or how we should feel, or how that person is likely to feel. And then the thoughts that seem to emerge automatically are just informed by our past experience. And then the thoughts that emerge automatically in anxiety, like you say, could be our anticipation of what might happen, what future situation we're going to be in. It's interesting. I never thought about it that way. The you now only has a certain bandwidth, but you before, and where you might be, which is informed by you before, that's like you use that subconscious is just like a big pool of information that you had from the past that you use then to manage the present moment, and thoughts are kind of just a communicator of that. Yeah.
And if there's bits of, I don't know if this is the same thing. Remind me, Joel, who I think it's Jung, isn't it? Who has kind of like the diagram of the shadow and the ego, and bits of that. Would that kind of go under the same thing of, well, there's not necessarily parts of yourself, it's just one self, and these are different. These are just maybe fluctuations between states of being.
Yeah. I mean, his idea was that the self was this kind of big, quite unfathomable pool of all the potential versions of you that you could be, including all that stuff about your past and your shadow, and your ego is this very small kind of island on top of that pool, which is the conscious you that isn't aware of the self. But maybe what we're talking about here is questioning, well, are you also the parts of yourself that you don't understand? Maybe that's true, because it's still part of you. It's just like you haven't really got your head around it yet, and maybe you never will. But maybe we can't just identify with ego in this moment, because that doesn't really do us justice. There's so much depth and complexity to being a human being, and maybe we need to take ownership of that and not label it as like an unconscious that we can't control, but label it as that's just me, the parts of me I don't yet understand yet, and that's an exciting thing. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about, I have a bias towards this because I'm currently reading Beyond Good and Evil, but I wanted to ask about your thoughts on Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy.
Oh, yeah. That's a great book. Everyone knows the two forces he describes in that book are the Apollonian or whatever, and Dionysian. Kind of ties into what we're saying, both of them, I would say, but in different aspects. Obviously, they're two sides of the spectrum. Apollo is like the sun god. The actual myth is like he married a mortal, and that mortal cheated on him or whatever, so he killed the mortal, but he ended up saving his son, like from the mortal's like belly or whatever, or something like that. And then his son became this healer and started bringing the dead back to life. And then Zeus, I think, killed his son or threw a lightning bolt and killed Apollo's son. And Apollo wanted to get back, so Apollo killed the Cyclops that created Zeus's thunderbolts or lightning bolts, whatever. But I guess the point of that story is like both myths, the Apollon and the Dionysian or whatever, come from Greek like tragedy, I guess, Greek art, but also Greek art in general, especially according to Nietzsche, is kind of like a hybridization of those two aspects of human nature. Like the tree, that would be like the Apollonian, and then the like drunk, intoxicated like state he would attribute to Dionysus, because Dionysus himself, I think, and Zeus, just the sight of Zeus killed Dionysus's mom, just the sight alone, like burned her or something like that. And then I think Zeus like saved Dionysus from his mom's stomach, similar to how Apollo saved his son, but then Zeus stitched Dionysus into his like thigh or something. So Dionysus was like twice born, basically. So he's technically the son of Zeus, and Apollo's the son of Zeus as well. So they're like half brothers, I guess. But these half brothers had very different paths. Dionysus was like a cult leader. He traveled the world like spreading ideas about like wine and how to do magic. And he's the reason like Midas could turn stuff to gold. And yeah, just like a partier, I guess. And Apollo is more of the artistic, disciplined version.
Why are these gods in beef?
I don't know. I'm very limited on like, I don't even know if they met. Do you know if they met? I'm not sure. I guess they're just two sides of the coin of human nature. For some reason, Nietzsche, he's the one that kind of systematized those as like Apollo as the dreamlike, Dionysus as the drunken, intoxicated like aspects. But obviously that came up in Greek tragedy as well. But like, I guess they're just opposing forces, right? Like they're clearly opposite. At least to Nietzsche, you could argue they're not, but you can't carve a statue of like Zeus if you're drunk. You can only do that if you are in this dreamlike, focused, artistic state where you're drawing these mental forms from, the ether, basically. If you were drunk, you could maybe destroy a statue, and that in and of itself is kind of valuable. You wouldn't be able to destroy a statue, have that kind of visceral, emotive, empathetic quality if you were in the opposite state. So I would say they're just like innately dichotomous.
And is this dreamlike and the drunk, is this kind of a form of human experience that he's trying to maybe symbolize?
Yeah, definitely. I would say like two aspects of like the human soul or something. So they underlie all of our experiences. And he thinks like the greatest art marries those two, in its form.
Is that it kind of have similarities to like heaven and hell?
Yeah, I could see that. Although neither are bad, like especially because you're supposed to combine them. But I guess I'm not religious, but I would say hell is obviously somewhere you don't want to go. And I wouldn't say that being Dionysian, living your life kind of intoxicated, and I don't think that would lead you to hell. I would say it's like a horseshoe, I guess, like, or an upside down horseshoe, where like if you're at like one side of the spectrum or the other exclusively, then you'll probably end up in hell. But if you're kind of like balanced in the middle, you're closer to heaven or you're closer to the divine, I would say, yeah.
Kind of like a chaos and order as well. You need a little.
Yeah, I was going to say that you need you can't. I think any extreme is bad in terms of a trait or a way to live life. If you so it's kind of like the opposite of being fluid, like water. It's like you freeze yourself into one, like this is the way I want to be, or this is the thing that I'm doing, and you don't remain adaptable. And really, because of the fact that we're largely not in control of how life can sort of twist and turn and change, you need to have both sides. You need to be a little bit chaotic and a little bit sort of intoxicated and free flowing and unambitious and float around a bit. But you also need some structure, and you do need to be able to sort of discipline yourself and be able to focus. And it's the ability. I guess a lot of philosophy teaches about being able to be two things at once. I guess seemingly two different opposing like ways of living at once, like this being this fighter, but also being at a state of peace, like we talked about, or bringing intensity, but also being fluid, but allowing yourself to be chaotic, but also be disciplined and focused at times. It's like, can you can you be both of those things at once? Because if you find that there's something quite profound in that. I think you like you said, Jake, characters like Mr. Miyagi, they encapsulate that. Great superheroes encapsulate that. And we do find something fascinating about that, I think.
Yeah, it makes you complete. I wanted to ask about your opinion on sort of German idealism and people like Kant.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good transition, because German idealism is kind of about being complete. They're reacting to the Descartesian, or like rationalism, I guess, just scientism that, like I said earlier, posits that we're just kind of an empty shell. You need more than that. You need intuition and you need empathy. And science left off with no solution to that. So German idealism is supposed to solve that. That's what Kant was originally trying to do. And Kant's basically the father of German idealism, like, if we're being real. And I guess the four main ones are like Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. All of them are like the domino effect from Kant. Post-Kantians disagree with a lot of what he says. They think that Kant wasn't as fundamental as even the science before them. He was kind of allowing science to be the ground, and he was just up in the air, starting at the end, kind of. But basically, Kant wanted to figure out what we can know, because he also had a problem with, like, I think, therefore I am. He thinks, well, we should be able to know others as well. Like, you shouldn't just not believe in that, or just because it's not scientifically proven or whatever. So like we were talking about earlier, Kant kind of tries to develop that proof through our relation to others, and not enough. But Fichte got more into that relationship. He was way more political too. He was trying to like save Germany from the France occupation, and he basically just started talking about community. And then Schelling kind of took that into like more of a natural, I guess, like more of a naturalistic scope. So he thought that you can't just say that the fundamental nature of reality or the fundamental nature of the mind is like community either. You have to also say, like, without nature, we wouldn't be here. So it starts at nature, and we're also nature. We're a product of nature, like this organic evolution and unfolding from what's naturally already there. And then I guess Hegel just wraps that all up into a nice theory of history, basically, where he teaches you how to resolve at absolute knowledge. And I think he like attributes that, or he relates that to like the imagery of a flower, how a flower like starts as a seed and it blooms, and he thinks the bloom itself is community and love and like relationships and all that kind of stuff, which people often like misinterpret Hegel, because he has this chapter called the master-slave dialectic, and he's saying the opposite of what people think he is. People think he's justifying slavery, but he's literally saying that the slave has more of a connection to the world, because the master is the one who like isolates themselves from community and lives in like castles and is antisocial, while the slave is still connected and grounded to the world, basically.
Yeah, I guess it's quite polarizing if you are supporting Descartes. Like, when you think about having kids, it's like, well, if only the self exists, then what about your kids? Do they not exist even though they're a part of you? And I think the good way to think about, I think you said Shelley, it was that how we're all sort of, I kind of align with a lot of the ideas, the circle of life and the collective consciousness. I think there seems to be a weight about it, of connection of humanity. And
it's interesting, that solipsism point, because you don't live your life acting as if only you exist. Like, I know, Jacob, when you went through an era in your teenagehood where you sort of wanted to believe that you were the only thing that existed, and sort of that gave you that main character energy to go and do the shit you do in your life. And there's a time and a place for that and everything. But isn't the reason we do pretty much everything we do for other people, for how they feel about us, for how we make them feel, for that shared experience together? And if they're not real, then why are we doing that? What really motivates us? There's a level of reality in the fact that it motivates us to do the things we do. It enables us to go and create in the world and get good at stuff, and sort of all of it. All of our life is about other people, I guess. We're so webbed in this sort of big interconnected mass of humanity in ways that we don't even realize. I mean, that was sort of outlined to me in the book I read called The Courage to be Disliked, that all your problems are to do with how you are interpersonally with other people, because how you feel a lot of the time is to do with those different dynamics. So if you feel like you're the only one that exists, then what is there to say about your emotions? They're very real. Rejection is very real. Pain is very real. Your connection and love are very, very real things. So you need that other person to do that. You can't do that on your own. That's a very specific thing.
Yeah, good point. I mean, self-awareness, I think, is the big thing that you need to mediate through other people. Like, you can't really be self-aware if you think you're the only one who exists.
Yeah, I reckon that there's I think there's probably some links to, selfishness and stuff. I guess I was drawn to solipsism. Well, it was from like a kind of psychedelic experience that like kind of showed me up. But I know, I guess that was one of the first kind of philosophical ways that really like when I went through that experience and you kind of go through a profound thing of, damn, you're actually like alive right now, and you gotta like get some like main character energy and change the way that your life is. I guess, yeah, there was a link to start taking action and like building yourself up and stuff. So yeah, that was my kind of drawing towards it. And but I think almost a better way to live of utilizing the community and things like that, because it's much sort of happier existence. It's a balance of the two, I guess.
Yeah, true. Can't have one without the other, I guess.
Can we talk about nihilism before we end? Because you said something in your voice note yesterday, Jacob, about Arcane's thoughts on nihilism.
Aren't you a nihilist?
Yeah, I'd probably say so. Yeah.
Why?
Because I feel like I know that there's no inherent meaning to life. I've tried existentialism, creating my own meaning. I've tried absurdism, and maybe I'm just like mentally ill or depressed or something, but it's never worked. Like absurdism is fun and it works temporarily, but I've never had the ability to permanently change how I feel, which is life has no meaning.
So 2 questions in my mind stem from that. One is, surely though, at some point you've had an experience where your life has felt like it's meant something. And the second question is, then if you've come to this conclusion, you're very sure of it, like what are you supposed to then do about things? How are you then supposed to live out the rest of your life? If that's the case, what's the kind of guidebook now?
There is none. I mean, right now, I think, like we were just talking about German idealism, I think it's kind of the human duty, even if you're a nihilist, to continue life. So not necessarily reproduce yourself, but at least contribute to the community and contribute to like the expansive or constructive forces of the universe and not the destructive ones. So nihilism, a lot of people think it's like destructive. I don't think it is. I think it's just the lack of anything. It's just nothing. And in a way, that's kind of just a passive way to live life. And it's not a plan. So my answer would be there is no plan other than the moments where I kind of, you're right that like there have been moments in my life where it feels meaningful, but those are fleeting and those are constantly fleeting. And I'm just tired, So the plan is to just give up and like sleep in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sorry, I'll let you go.
I was just going to say, then surely isn't contributing to the community in itself a meaningful experience, because you're doing something that impacts other people in a significant way, in some significant way, and therefore it means something to them. Like there's meaning behind your actions. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm interested. I'm just asking questions here. Like, how do you define it as it means it has to have this overarching, almost divine, like universe level meaning behind the things we do? Or can meaning be like how you made that person feel when you interacted with them? Does that mean something, or is that something completely different? Is that just emotions? Is that just brain chemistry? Is that just hormone changes?
I would say that's just emotions. Yeah. Meaning people imbue life with meaning. So it's not that meaning doesn't exist, but it's just subjective and an illusion. So yeah, that does certainly mean something, and that's what's definitely keeping me going. So maybe I'm not an actual nihilist, but like talking to you guys or interacting with my comments, even if they're like hate comments, I live for that, So, but if you want to say like meaning kind of implies like either an end or like some purpose, kind of, at least some. It doesn't have to be divine, but I guess some intrinsic, like, this is happening for a reason. And I just don't think that's the case. Like, especially when I think about the bad things that have happened in my life or the bad things that can happen. If I were to go give a homeless person like money or something and for them to go like get food, not that you shouldn't, but let's say you do that and then as they're going to get food, they walk across the street, they get hit by a bus. Like, there's nothing promising, like meaning, there's nothing promising good. And even if you think you're doing good, or even if what you think you're doing is meaningful in a certain way, it might just backfire.
I'd agree that meaning is subjective. But so if I kind of come across my view of a couple of things I would find meaningful, one would be having a kid and kind of watching them grow and nurture them. And I'd say another one would be achievement. Is that they're not both meaningful?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say so. Now that, I asked Joel, I asked him if you guys have kids. You don't yet. You guys are pretty young, but I don't either. But my siblings have kids, and I guess just through that, I've been able to see how that's given their life meaning. My sister had kids like when she was 19. I'm 23 now. So it feels like it's creeping up on me, even though it's not. Like, we would all like to have kids probably around 30, maybe, but it still feels like I might miss that opportunity, and that scares me a lot. Like the fact that I might just go my whole life and die and like never Like, it's not about reproducing myself. It's just about raising somebody and giving them the potential of a good life that I don't want to miss out on. So that's definitely meaningful. Yeah.
And what about achievement? Like,
Just
would you find
in
meaning
general?
in like the journey, like in the journey of like improving yourself, and in some sort of pursuit?
I think it's dangerous to do that. There's a quote from like the movie Whiplash that like the most dangerous thing you can say to somebody is like good job. I really believe that. You can't take your achievements and just let it build your ego. You have to constantly be attacking yourself, like constantly be just like critiquing where you aren't achieving in order to achieve, basically. You obviously have to be self-aware, and when you do good, recognize that it's good so maybe can reproduce that, obviously. But you don't want to just stagnate. You don't want to just say, yo, this is good, we're not going to make any more improvements from here. You want to constantly be moving to the next level, and that requires us, not settling, something like that.
Yeah, I get what you're saying with is not a particularly good thing for our ego. And me and Jill have said before that if you kind of associate yourself in hierarchies, then you are in a competence hierarchy of success in some pursuit, then you're either going to be inferior or superior to someone, both of which are bad consequences. But I do feel like there's a way of like obtaining some sort of worldly success and achievement and still keeping spiritually okay.
Well, I think I don't know if you agree with this, but I think it comes from the place at which you come from to do that thing. And what I mean by that is, if it's about you, then it's egotistical, and you're going to be stuck in that. You're either inferior or superior kind of paradigm that's not optimal for well-being or sort of your spiritual health. But if you do it from, okay, we're doing this thing to pursue truth, to pursue knowledge, to interact with people, to become better human beings, so that we can be better friends or better partners or better sons. That coming from that perspective, where you're doing it in the pursuit of something meaningful and bigger than ourselves or for somebody else or for our community, then I can see how that's meaningful and moves away from that kind of the dangers of individualism and ego. If you did it just because, I want X amount of followers and I want to make this amount of money and I want to feel really smart so I can say stupid smart things on the internet and people like say what they want about it or whatever, for attention, for praise, for status, then that's not good. But if it comes from this kind of a more deeper, more sort of loving, more whole approach that doesn't just focus on us as individuals, but us as a collective, and maybe, deeper ideas about truth, and then you avoid that. I don't know. Do you agree?
Yeah, that's gonna make me think for a while, probably. Yeah, I think I've probably been too selfish so far, especially with my like online pursuits. I really need, it's out of need. I need money. I need status technically to make money if I'm a content creator. So, and I look at other content creators like I don't know, the Paul brother, like Logan Paul or something, was like 2 years younger than me now when he got famous, and he got famous off of raw ego, almost this like sociopathic belief in himself, arrogance. And I've been convinced that that's the way to go. But now that you guys have kind of made me a little less nihilistic, probably.
Well,
I mean, we're not saying that that's bad. I mean, it's an interesting thing because we never really spoke to a nihilist before. I guess so. Up until now, have you kind of like had like no plan?
It's at the funniest moments.
he's always about to go into a
do
really
this.
juicy point and then his connection.
Yeah.
Don't do this. Can you see me and see me now?
I can, Jake, loud and clear.
So have you kind of had no plan, like up until this point, like just sort of living, like seeing where the wind takes you, and just kind of like not attributing meaning to anything?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I don't know what is gonna work. I mean, how I was raised, like I didn't have much guidance. Like my mother raised me basically single because my dad, he got in a car crash when he was younger and he never like worked. He was on welfare, and he also got, I mean, not to get too personal, but like, or trauma dump or whatever, but he like was addicted to painkillers. So I didn't like have a guiding force in life. And my mom is just constantly working. So I had to figure it out on my own. And I haven't really gone anywhere.
I guess something to think about for us, Joel, is like people with like tough lives, can they really be an existentialist? Well, I mean, I guess they can and grow from the point that they were at, but I think it's a lot harder to be this positive person that thinks that there's going to be virtue and change and things like that.
Well, this is I'll finish on this point before I've got to go. 5:15. I'm sorry, boys, but there was one time I was under the influence of a substance, and I came to this realization, and the realization was, God, my problems are such privileged problems. Instead of getting annoyed about them, I should just be grateful for them. Because how amazing it is that I'm in a position that I'm worrying about shit like what I find meaningful in life, or like what fulfills me, or like how do I psychologically approach my work life or my relationships or whatever. It's like, that's such a beautiful problem to have.